So thank you all for joining. This has been a really amazing opportunity. Before I get into the report today, I would like to acknowledge the audience and all the folks here today. You are really all the folks that I've been keeping in mind while doing this report. You're either from the oyster industry or the food industry or just a really interested consumer. So again, if you're new here, in order for everyone just to get to know each other in the room a little bit better, I encourage you all to type in the chat in Zoom your name, maybe the business that you're associated with, and if you're feeling really brave, please feel free to share with us your first experience eating an oyster. Everyone's experience is different, and they're all interesting. So if you're a consumer, here's some really quick background information and some quick context about the report. So most of the oysters grown in Massachusetts are destined for the half-shell market in restaurants. So as you can imagine, when restaurants shut down during the COVID-19 pandemic, the industry had this glut of product on their hands and like little to no market options. Thankfully, though, there were these COVID relief funds were made available, and projects like those conducted by Barnstable County Cooperative Extension and their partners created programs that bought oysters from the growers and paid to get them shucked, and then donated the shucked oyster meats and oyster stew to food banks. But the pandemic really highlighted that the Massachusetts oyster industry is vulnerable to market disruptions because they do not have a diversified portfolio of shucked oyster products. So this whole report, which is linked in the chat, and you can also use this QR code here, this whole report was created to help the industry envision what a more diversified portfolio could look like, and also help them consider aspects that they should keep in mind as they continue to grow the industry. So this report highlights the moments of oyster history that should not be repeated, but it also highlights the moments in history that could be revived and celebrated. The report uses history, recipes, and lived experiences to identify potential opportunities and challenges in creating shucked oyster products. And at the end of this report, all the information is distilled and used to provide potential shucked oyster products recommendations for the industry to evaluate. So I'm not going to cover the entire report. Instead, I'm going to highlight some key findings from the history, recipe development, and interview section of the report, and explain how the findings inform the 18 proposed products listed at the end of the report. I should just let you all know that the upcoming slides include screenshots of pages from the report, and some of those screenshots have text in them. But please do not try to read all that text. They're just screenshots of the report for you to merely reference which section of the report I'm talking about. I practiced this presentation for my husband last night, and he just put his face right up to the screen. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he was trying to read all the text. So they're just screenshots for references. Please don't try to read them. All right, this is what I'm talking about. Don't try to read that. So the 52-page report is the result of reading over 20 books, tons of digitized newspapers dating back to the early 1900s, archived restaurant menus, and a small mountain of cookbooks, and even listening to a handful of podcasts. So over 200,000 years of oyster history really got distilled onto 6 pages in this report. And as you read through those 6 pages, you might see, or I see at least, these 4 key themes recurring over and over again. The first theme is that oysters have been supporting human populations around the world for tens of thousands of years. And I found this so fascinating, the fact that oysters have been found on every continent. I found it to be amazing. It's like oysters are this string that really continues to keep humans tied together. A second thing is that oysters are not just an indicator of social status in society. Oysters were and have been there for everyone, regardless of economic means, and they continue to be. So at any point in history, people would eat oysters because they were poor, or they could eat oysters because they were rich. They were used to celebrate in high society. They were eaten on the streets at a cart for a penny a piece. You were ate oysters because you were healthy, or maybe you were actually prescribed oysters as a remedy if you were sick. So in short, oysters have always been and continue to be accessible to everyone. A third theme is that history has showed us that oysters go through these periods of exploitation where they become overharvested, polluted, or decimated by disease. And these periods of exploitation are sometimes followed by periods of revival with new policies, better practices, and advancements in technology. And this theme also carries over to the oyster industry. So not just the oysters themselves, but also to the oyster industry. Oyster history is filled with exploiting people through slavery, forced labor, and child labor. And oysters also have a history of revival when it comes to environments, communities, and oysters have even played a major role in restoring international relations after war. So I hope you see why the report starts with history. It's important to consider the history of oysters when we think about creating the future for oysters. History is filled with lessons that hopefully we have learned by now, that we learn what not to do. And history is also filled with these factoids that celebrate how oysters continue to bring people together. And so since this project is about shucked oyster products, we are going to give more attention to this fourth theme. The fact that oysters continue to be so versatile, especially in cuisine. So again, please don't try and read all of the text on the slide. I really want to start talking about food. Hopefully you have a snack in front of you. Every time I came across a recipe, I threw it into this recipe database, and it now has recipes from the late 1700s to present day. And regardless of time, the same food pairing keeps showing up. There's eggs, cream, bread, pork fat, vinegar, wines, and spices. And these combinations made sense for the 1700s up until the early 1900s. Eating food wasn't a thing like it is now. Eating 3 times a day is almost gluttonous. If you were lucky enough back then, you ate once, maybe twice a day, and you really had to get your fill of calories in that meal so you would want high fat, high protein, and carbs so you would have enough energy to keep working. Also, cooking in the United States up until the early 1900s was a time-intensive process. So a lot of the recipes you'll notice can be made in a single pot, or preservation techniques were used with vinegar and wine to save time and food for the future. And I bring this all up as we talk about the future, potential future oyster products, because we can lean on these traditional pairings of fat and carbs, but we don't have to, because we don't really have to eat like that anymore. I say all that, however, when I asked Ryan Gent and Becca Engoff to play with some historical oyster recipes and really go in their own direction, playing with oysters, I will say though that both of them really did love the carbs component. They both had carbs included in their recipes. So when I invited Ryan Gent and Becca Engoff to get inspired by some historical oyster recipes and to test their own, they both had like a bread or a noodle component in their dishes. For some more context, Ryan Gent is a really wonderful professional cook out here in Western Mass, and Becca Engoff is this amazing oyster lover who is now the director of procurement at Wolf's Seafood and has a really rich background in culinary training. And here are just a few of the dishes that they made when I told them to just get inspired and have fun. At the center is an oyster powder that I actually asked Ryan to make. It's dried oysters that then you get pulverized into a powder, and then you use that to make an oyster infused dashi. There's also a veggie flatbread with buttered oysters and sumac that Becca made, and some soy glazed mushrooms alongside some Barnstable oysters. And I bring all of these up because despite going in totally different directions, Ryan and Becca's feedback about their experience cooking oysters was really similar. They both spoke about how oysters are so versatile. And this is great news for oyster industry because as we envision future products, it's great to know that oysters have so many different options that other animal proteins like chicken or beef really don't have.